So thank you, Professor Tronci, for showing us some syntactic insights on these motion verbs, very peculiar motion verbs. And now I welcome here Professor Craig Morrison. Posso fare breve? Who is the dean? What should I say? Who is the dean of the Faculty of Ancient Near Eastern Studies here at PBI, where he teaches also Syriac, Aramaic languages. He's part of the editorial committee of the BHQ, Biblia Ebraica Quinta, and also one of the editors in charge of the books of Samuel with Professor Pessoa and Balzaretti. That's enough? Okay. So the floor is yours. Without further ado, I give you the floor. And your title was David Movement toward Absalom in 2 Samuel 13:39, hostile or friendly. Let's see.
Grazie Benedetta, grazie Paola per averci organizzato. Secondo le parole di Gian Pietro, che sto imparando un sacco di cose in questi giorni, anche non è un campo di cui ero molto avevo molta conoscenza, perciò è affascinante, non leggerò più la Bibbia nello stesso modo dopo questa conferenza. Proietto tutto il lavoro per il mio accento. I speak in Italian. Okay, no, for my English accent can be problematic, so I'm just going to project the text and you can read it along with me and hopefully it will be clear. The argument is a bit complex. So verbs of motion in biblical narratives are often metaphors that express relationships among characters, as Paola points out in her introduction to this conference. But translating an ancient verb of motion is a very thorny business. We shift from an ancient culture in a different and sometimes obscure language limited to a written text with its ancient genre into our native languages and worlds of meaning. In our field of study, the distance between the ancient texts we read and the contemporary worlds we inhabit is vast. Verbs of motion are particularly challenging because they can have a literal and non-literal meaning. These non-literal meanings can be elusive or indeterminate. Take, for example, the phrase, they entered into the church and then entered into a marriage, typical in English. The first verb would have the components of a verb of motion. It is concrete and visibly perceivable. The second verb is non-literal or metaphorical. Entering into a marriage is not concrete, picking up from the Dijk's notion that you just mentioned, Liana. Where is the marriage physically? It is not visibly perceivable, and those present in the church cannot see the marriage. The translation of this sentence into a modern language is also revealing. The literal meaning of the first verb of motion presents no problem when rendered into Italian, sono entrati in chiesa. But the second verb, which has a non-literal meaning, is more problematic. The translation, sono entrati in un matrimonio, makes no sense in Italian. This simple example between two modern languages alerts us to the complexity of the issues we are dealing with. Some of the ideas in this paper have emerged from my collaboration with Leonardo Pessoa and Claudio Balzaretti in our preparation of the BHQ edition for 1 and 2 Samuel. We have not yet reached this verse in our collaboration, but many of the questions we have discussed shine through my argument today. 2 Samuel 13:39 contains a main verb complemented by an infinitive of motion. So we have Votekel David Hamelech Letzeth el Absalom. The proposition in focus here is Letzeth el Absalom is composed of a verb-particle construction. The preposition el is a function word that expresses the grammatical relationship between David and Absalom. But what does it mean for David to go out ex Absalom? How to interpret this verb of motion with this preposition? The semantic components of the verbs of motion. The verb of motion, as we saw so well presented last night by Gus, contains the figure, the ground, the motion, the path, and then the manner. And that's what I'm dealing with here. There is a particular problem of the interpretation with tikal. Mirko Pozzobon has made a careful study of this verb in his La Pescita del Secondo Libro di Samuele. The Masoretic text reads a peal of kala, a Wayictal third feminine singular, but there is no subject in the neighborhood that is feminine singular. The Septuagint adds to pneuma, ruach, and interprets with takal, with the verb kupazo, to cease. So you have eko, pasen, ton pneuma, don basileos, tu ex elthein, and then we'll talk about what we have, 3 prepositions trying to get at that el in Hebrew. So the spirit of the king ceased to go out after Absalom, or you have moraukas, the king had no mental strength left to go against Absalom. The Vulgate ignores this problem and reads Vuikal with David as the subject. So we have Cesavit que Davide rex persegue Absalom. So this is a very interesting. So Septuagint and the Vulgate imply that David had gone out hostilely against Absalom, or had the possibility of continuing to accomplish this motion event of going out to Absalom in a hostile manner. Hallot, with others, revocalize this verb as wetekel, call, wetekel ruach, with the gloss to languish or pine, which is close to the translation of Targum Jonathan, which adds nafsha and interprets tau kaf lamed with tekel, and then reads hamedat. So you have hamedat nafsha de David malka lumipak al Absalom. So the nefesh of David desired to go out after Absalom. The verb chetmem daled in the Targum does not express a hostile intent on David's part, and therefore the Aramaic expression mepik al Absalom does not express physical movement, but an emotional state, from motion to emotion. This could also be the meaning in 4Q Samuel A, which adds ruach, reflecting the Septuagint's vorlog, and there's it's the third line down. You can see the chet and hamelech. However, Jason Driesbach, in his excellent study of 4Q Samuel A, maintains the hostile sense, quote, probably the meaning of this verse is that David stopped desiring to pursue Absalom for revenge, and that for revenge is his. But if 4Q Samuel A is interpreted to call as wetekel, then we have the translation, the spirit of David longed to go out to Absalom. And with the Targum, Yatsa'el loses its hostile manner and part of its literal sense. The outer landscape, the concrete visibility of this possible motion event in the Septuagint and the Vulgate shifts to inside David's mind, David's inner landscape, and the phrase takes on a metaphorical meaning. Just as an aside, very quickly, I think the MT is earlier, and you could see why as we go through this. The focus of the problem then is on Yatsa'el, especially the preposition el in 1339, but then we also have al, to pick up this morning Lucy's talk in 14:1. You have Wayedak Yoab ben Suriyah, ki lev hamelech al. Al in 14:1 can be interpreted either as the heart of David was on Absalom, or the heart of David was against Absalom. So 14:1 does not help resolve our quandary. Briefly, before continuing, because part of this is exegetical, this conference, it cannot be overemphasized the importance of this verse for understanding the entire David narrative. David's overall decision to rehabilitate Absalom will prove disastrous. David should have left Absalom with his uncle Talmai in Gesher. 1339 is among the most important verses for interpreting the character of David and the coming rebellion, and it is a crux interpretum, or in literary terms, its meaning is quite indeterminate. The meaning of Yatsa with the preposition el is described by Frank Pollack, whereas halak is mostly neutral with regard to orientation, or takes the source as a point of departure. Yatsa is usually used to describe the way viewed from the point of departure, often a closed and thus protected space, such as, for an example, with the residence as origin. Among the most thorough studies, which has already been mentioned, of the verb yatsa with different prepositions is that of Ostel in his unpublished dissertation. And again, thank you to our library staff for securing this dissertation for me. Regarding yatsa al-el, he writes, al is used infrequently with yatsa, but has the same semantic emphasis here as elsewhere, over and upon, whether in a neutral or hostile sense. So it's not going to help us. It is also, as elsewhere, occasionally used with el. Our problem here might be where el might be expected, and no discernible difference in sense. Mirko Potsabon, in his work on this verse, identified 7 examples where Yatsa el is hostile. And these are the 7 examples. I don't need to read them. You can just trust me. So the Septuagint and the Vulgate interpretations to cease indicate that David had gone out against Absalom, or had the possibility of going out to Absalom, a spatial movement in which David opted no longer to exercise. The spatial dimension would be more specific if the narrator had mentioned the ground and path, namely that David ceased to go out to Absalom in Gesher, though since Gesher was just mentioned in the previous verse, perhaps the path and destination should be assumed. But the implied manner of Yatsa el in the Vulgate and in the Septuagint remain hostile. A battle metaphor is the most immediate meaning of the Hebrew text. The subject of Yatsa is the aggressor, and the complement for El is the person under attack. Obviously, the aggressor goes forth with the expectation of victory. There is also here a deep irony in that the hostility expressed in the phrase that David ceased to go out, namely to attack Absalom, in 2 chapters later, David is under attack, and in fact, David physically, spatially, will be forced to go out from Jerusalem. If we revocalize halot with others and read tekel, David longed, reading with the Targum, then the spatial sense of Yatsael is less in focus, and in fact, we shift from a visible outer landscape, David having the possibility of going to Gesher to attack Absalom, to an inner landscape, David's ruach or nafsha, and unfortunately in the literature, people will claim that the Targum and the Septuagint read together, but anyone in first year Hebrew Aramaic can see they don't. Anyways, reading David, referring to David's inner landscape, and David's longing does not involve any movement at all, just his desire to think about Absalom. The manner of the verb of motion, Yatsael, is embedded then in the main verb tekel, resulting in a non-literal meaning for Yatsael, whose metaphoric sense expands in the imagination of the reader. If we accept the non-literal meaning of Yatsael, then 14:1 means that Joab perceives that David's heart was somehow focused in a positive sense on Absalom, which is Wellhausen's interpretation, and of course, as usual, Wellhausen is followed by many others. But if this is the case, it raises other exegetical problems. Why did Joab need to send a phony widow from Tekoa to convince David to rehabilitate Absalom? And why did David refuse to see Absalom when Joab brought him back to Jerusalem? But that also is for another time. The rereading of this verse in 4Q Samuel A and in the Targum is illustrated by Sally Rice, who identifies regular semantic shifts usually brought about through metaphorical expansion, and that's her design, and I think that's what's going on here. In the Masoretic text, as interpreted by the Septuagint and the Vulgate, David ceased. We have David's possible intention to relocate from his spatial location, David in his palace, to Absalom in Gesher. If we read Nafsha Ruach Tekel, the spirit nefesh of David longed, then the phrase Yatsael no longer is no longer a literal verb of motion, and it traces the shift in David's state of mind and his intentions to non-literal movement. The Septuagint manuscripts reveal the problems the translators, revisers, and scribes had with interpreting the preposition el. Here I'm not going to go through the data, but you can see the Vaticanus reads pros, the Lucianic tradition reads epi, and then the rest of the manuscripts, the Hexapolaric, which Rolfs then follows for some reason, reads opiso. And so I'm not going to repeat all of this, I just go through the data to show that the conclusion is very simple. In the end, all three choices of prepositions in the Greek textual tradition indicate that the problem the ancient translators and revisers had with Hebrew el and their three choices may or may not express hostile intent. But I would suggest that in 1 Samuel 13:39, the intent is hostile in the Septuagint. The Peshitta offers even more complicated solutions, which is unusual for the Peshitta. It translates Yatsael with nefak batar, which is indeed hostile. And we see that in Joshua 2:5, just as one example, but many others. Now, the problem is that the Peshitta offers three different interpretations for Tau Kaf Lamed. The first interpretation, Achmi, David neglected to go out after Absalom. Second interpretation from other good manuscripts, Wet Tawash, David hesitated to go out after Absalom. And a third, I think it's probably just a scribal error in transmission, Wet Tawi, David repented to go out after Absalom. But of course, always these manuscript readings are more interesting than the lemma. The Peshitta does not agree with the Septuagint, 4Q Samuel A, or the Targum. Again, that for me argues for the MT, even if it's not readable or understandable. Among the versions, nefak botar expresses hostile relationship, but this is tempered by the main verb that focuses on the internal process within David. Thus, the Peshitta preserves the battle metaphor, but its interpretation of Tau Kaf Lamed embeds the manner of David's movement within David himself. It shifts from the outer landscape, David's ceasing, Septuagint, namely not exercising his right or possibility of attacking Absalom, to David's inner landscape, hesitating, neglecting, or repenting. Modern translations, now this is just interesting, we see the shift from outer landscape or motion to inner landscape, non-literal meaning of the motion verbs in the modern translations. I'm just going to give you a couple. The NAB, his intention of going out against Absalom was abated. This is, for me, spatial. It's literal. MacArthur is probably the best. King David's enthusiasm for marching out against Absalom was spent. Again, very spatial. Non-spatial, very interesting. The JPS, I think, is one of the best translations in English. King David was pining away for Absalom. So no spatial movement at all. NJB, his anger subsided. La c'è, e poi il re Davide cessò di sfogarsi. Again, no motion in that translation. Then I just go through other examples. These non-literal interpretations of the verb of motion indicate that Yatsael is no longer understood as a concrete and visibly perceivable motion. It has become a pure metaphor to describe David's inner landscape. Interpretation, and then conclusions. I'm almost finished. So how to interpret Yatsael? We see two clear possibilities. As a literal verb of motion, it expresses David's possibility of going out to Absalom in a hostile manner. The Vulgate and the Septuagint imagine this as a motion event that David opted not to accomplish, and we imagine the outer landscape of David's life, his hostile movement toward Absalom. The Targum and perhaps 4Q Samuel A shift the action inside David's inner landscape. In the Targum, the manner of David's movement is embedded within the verb tekel. The nefesh of David was longing to go to Absalom. The phrase no longer has a literal meaning of movement. Its action is not visible. The Peshitta's interpretation maintains the hostile manner in which David would go out to Absalom, but the main verb shifts the focus to within David's inner landscape. The versions do not offer us a clear solution to this highly indeterminate phrase, a crux interpretum, but they offer us a fascinating study of how verbs of motion were handled by ancient translators. As modern translations indicate, both literal and non-literal interpretations are possible, along with both hostile and non-hostile interpretations. Perhaps these interpretations tell us more about the exegetes who proposed them than about the meaning of the biblical text and its versions. Finally, if we interpret this verse as reflecting David's inner landscape, then we enter the genre of tragedy. David is a tragic character, an important question, but for another time. Thank you.